Hello, welcome to this installment of my video series on special education staffing in San Francisco Unified School District. This edition looks at the pressure that grew to expand inclusion and the audit recommendations that, if implemented, would begin to blur the lines between resource specialists and inclusion teacher. In 2010, the state took control of the special education department at SFUSD and ordered the correction of 21 violations. Some complaints were related to the speed at which the district had implemented IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Specifically, the relevant complaint here was that the district had not supported the move of enough students into general education classrooms. The state was interested in one thing: number of students who received 50% plus of their education in a general education classroom. The inclusion support team, on the other hand, had been focused on a completely different metric: number of students making progress on IEP goals while receiving as close to 100% of their education in general education as possible. And the Inclusion Task Force had prioritized inclusive education for the students with the most severe disabilities first. Compliance with the state mandate would mean a shift toward inclusion for the students still enrolled in mild to moderate SDC classrooms, and it would likely mean a gradual return to SDC rooms for students with the most extensive needs. I do not have a lot of information about what happened in special education between 2006 and 2009, except that the state took over in 2010. But a report that was at least a year in the making was published in September of 2010 by the Urban Special Education Leadership Collaborative. The report made several recommendations. The report is available at a link in the video description below. The first shift the report recommended was that inclusive practices should extend to every school and every student. An urgency evident in the report may have been due to the state takeover that happened the year the report was published. Prior to this, parents had to choose between schools that had either an SDC classroom or an inclusive schools program or a resource specialist program. Few schools had every program available, so school assignment was a very different process for families of children with disabilities. If these policies were to be implemented, there was a growing concern students might not receive the specialized support they required, even from their special education teachers. For example, a former resource specialist may not have been trained in services and supports for students with severe disabilities, and those who taught in mod to severe SDC classes were not always familiar with the best approach to remediate reading difficulties among dyslexic students. Another recommendation relevant to this video series is the recommended staffing ratios. Before we look at the new recommendations, let's review what the contractual staffing ratios looked like in 2010. Basically, inclusion caseloads matched the special education class size ranges between 6 and 12 students, and the RSP and inclusion programs were separate. The Urban Collaborative report was recommending an increase of up to 4 students, including some students who would previously have been served in a resource specialist program, which had a caseload cap at 28. This was not a huge increase in students, but because of the students' different needs, it would be particularly difficult to implement in elementary schools, where there were few staff and many classrooms to cover. In other words, the report suggested changing caseloads for SPED teachers by combining all student types onto one caseload. This was problematic for a number of reasons. The union contract didn't have caseloads for special day class teachers. They had class sizes. And as the last video mentioned, several union contract mechanisms prevented the resource specialist from being combined with a special day class. Reviewing the components of an IEP may help explain the challenge of this approach to SPED staffing. One student in a grade 4 classroom might be working on goals in decoding or fluency in high school, whereas a student in inclusive services, mod to severe, might be working on social skills. While one would require a pull-out model, the other student would require push and support. In other words, the two students require different services to meet their IEP goals, and the skilled staff supporting the students would therefore be different. Or if it were the same staff person, they would need to meet at 2 different times. In other words, the plan's recommendations couldn't go forward without a major overhaul of the union contract, But if the plan did go forward, it would look like this. And as you see here, the special education teacher would now have a blended program with students from all programs. Notice that this results in the loss of one paraeducator position for the moderate to severe class, as there is no longer a moderate to severe class. And in many elementary schools, there would only be enough students to support 2 special education teachers and 2 paraeducators. These 4 adults would need to provide support in up to 14 classrooms. This model has many strengths, and it is the direction many special educators would like to move in. All special education teachers will agree that the additional paraeducator would also be needed to provide support to general education teachers. However, if things do not go well with a student, that is, if a student is frustrated by academics that are too challenging, coupled with a general education teacher who does not know how to provide them with accommodations, the student is likely to act out and cause a disturbance in the classroom. Another difficulty is that when students do cause a behavior disturbance in one classroom, the special education teacher or paraeducator will have to stop providing services in another classroom in order to help put out fires. This should not be the case, but administrators had previously fallen short of providing school-wide supports for students with IEPs, and there was no reason to believe things would be different here. The recommendations of this audit were to move toward elimination of the special day classes and elimination of the resource specialist program. It was a bold move, and it would need union support to move forward. This quote, which was in a prior video as well, reminds us that it is the staff, not the setting, that supports students. In this new model, SPED staff would be stretched thin and not always available to support students and general education teachers. Furthermore, the professional development that was promised to staff never arrived at scale, so the staff were not always skilled. Summary. The audit made bold recommendations that all schools and all students with IEPs would be served in a general education setting at the family's school of residence. It made these recommendations without regard to the union contract. In our next video, the union betrays special education teachers, and the district negotiates a contract that paves the way for their inclusive education rollout. Special education teachers were not involved in the planning or implementation. Instead, consultants were brought in.